Alright, folks, let's continue with our discussion of a pair view of heels. You remember last week we talked about a little bit about the author, and by now you should know the author actually was born in Japan, in Nagasaki, Japan. He was not born in the UK, in Britain, in England, but now, because of his, educational background, because of his, literary achievement, he has become a very, very well-known writer in English, or English writer. Actually, you might remember 2 years ago, he was awarded with Nobel Prize of Literature, Ishiguro. And about the book, I also mentioned in my last class a little bit about the structure of the novel. Actually, whatever book you decide to study, when you open a book, usually what you need to be more careful is the so-called the overall structure of the novel. How the book is structured, like an architecture, how a building, how a house is structured. And this novel, we come to realize, is divided into 2 parts, altogether 11 chapters, with the first chapter as part 1, the second 5 chapters as part 2. So the end of part 1, in other words, the end of chapter 6, should be quite significant, and we will address the end of chapter 6 later. And overall, when we read a novel, we read a book, we have to imagine reading is like taking a journey. You start from somewhere and you end with somewhere. For example, if you want to travel from Taichung to Taipei, of course, Taichung is your starting point, is your beginning, and Taipei is your ending, is your destination. And reading, you can imagine, is more or less like taking a journey. So where to begin and where to end are 2 important, points when we approach a book or a novel. So I already talked a little bit about how the story begins, and also a little bit about how the story ends. But later on, I'm going to focus more on the ending of the novel. So just give yourself some, idea, some thinking about, how the book is structured. In other words, the overall structure of the book. And we know, as I mentioned last week, the story begins with a visit from Nikki, the younger daughter of Ezuko. Ezuko is the mother. Ezuko is also the narrator, the storyteller. And the story begins with the visit of Nikki, the younger daughter, traveling from London City to see the mother who lived in a big country house in suburban area of London. This is the beginning. So also, the novel begins with a travel from London to the suburban area of London. One crucial question for us to ask is why does Nikki pay a special visit to the mother? Of course, we can say because Nikki fears the mother is getting old. The mother lives in a house, in a country house. that is too big for her. The mother lives by herself, so she must feel a little bit lonely. And out of sense of filial piety in Chinese we call 孝道, okay? She decided to see the mother. But after we open the book, after we read the story, we come to realize actually the visit is more than this, okay? And when Nikki visits the mother, one issue, one topic, they decide try to avoid, try not to approach, is the issue of the elder sister, the issue of Keiko. Keiko, as the story says, she already died when the book begins. She died by killing herself using a rope in a big city in England, Manchester City. So they decide not to refer to Keiko. But in the story, these two, Nikki and the mother, always return back to Keiko, I'm sorry. So you could argue, if Keiko, because she's dead, if Keiko is regarded as a ghost, then we could argue the ghost always comes back to haunt both the mother and the younger sister, both Ezuko and Nikki. In that sense, you can read A Pale View of Years as a ghost story. Actually, I encourage you to read the novel from this perspective. You could well argue A Pale View of Years is a ghost story. And when we talk about the novel, of course, several issues need to come to our mind, especially the more or the major aspects of the novel. For example, the narrator, the storyteller, the perspective, the point of view. One good question for us to ask all the time is, who tells the story? Who narrates the story? Who is the storyteller? Who is the narrator? Because who narrates the story, who tells the story, will have a lot of influence or different, color over the story. We know truth is not absolute. Truth is relative. If we have 5 different people telling about the same accident or the same event, we might expect to have 5 different stories, because the same event is told by different storyteller, by different narrator, from different perspective. So that is the reason why, narration, narrative perspective, point of view has been regarded as one or even the most important, aspect of a story, of a novel. And in A Pale View of Years, we come to realize the speaker, the storyteller, always use I all the time. By using I, we could argue the narrator, the storyteller in this novel is a first-person narrator. And again, another question for you to think about. Why the author, why Ishiguro writes the novel with a first-person narrator? Why not the author, the writer himself, writes about the story? Why he has to use a character in the novel itself to tell the story? So Ezuko is the storyteller. Ezuko tells the story. But if you want to tell a story, you need to have an audience. You need to have a reader. Imagine who is the audience, who is the reader. Of course, Nikki. Nikki is the story, the listener, the reader of the story. And Ezuko tells the story to her own daughter, Nikki. Why? Why the mother has to tell her own story to the daughter? Why the daughter needs to listen to the mother's story? I think one interesting point is the daughter doesn't know what happened to the mother in the past. Ezuko is a woman moving from Japan to England because she had a second marriage. And the second husband happened to be a British gentleman. So when she married or remarried, she had to move from Japan to England. So what happened in Japan actually is not clear or remains unknown to Nikki. Nikki was born by Ezuko, the mother, with the British gentleman. So Nikki is a hybrid, is a mixture. So Nikki obviously is quite ignorant of what had happened to the mother in Japan before she was born. So Nikki came to see the mother in order to hear about what happened to the mother in the past. Then another interesting point is why does the mother need to tell the younger daughter her own story, what happened to her in Japan? Of course, to bridge the gap of knowledge, you could argue, because what happened in London, what happened in England, Nikki and the mother, they both know well enough. But what happened to the mother in Japan? Nikki obviously is quite ignorant, is in the dark. So the mother is trying to bridge the gap of Nikki's understanding, Nikki's knowledge of the mother in the past. But the mother has to tell her story. Why? This is another good question for us to think about. Why Ezuko in particular has to tell her story? Don't forget, Nikki just visited the mother, as the story says, only for 5 days. During these 5 days, you could imagine they can be engaged in many activities. They can go outing. They can, go out, taking a walk in the park. They did, actually, but they can do some other amusements, some other, interesting activities, or some more exciting activities. But obviously, you could imagine what happened to the daughter and the mother. When they get together, the mother is always telling her past story to the younger daughter, to Nikki. And it seems to us, Nikki is a good listener, even though sometimes Nikki chooses not to be very attentive. So why? Why storytelling? Why in particular Ezuko needs to tell the story? Did you ever think storytelling could be a kind of what? A kind of therapy. Therapy in Chinese, 治疗啊. This is therapy. In other words, writing itself is a kind of therapy. 写作是一种治疗. Imagine, Ezuko is writing the story. Ezuko is telling the story. So telling the story, writing or telling itself could be a therapy. So try to bear in mind, you can argue this novel from this perspective. Writing or storytelling as a therapy. Then you could imagine Ezuko must have suffered a lot. She must have a lot hidden in her heart, in her mind, and she has to speak it out. Otherwise, she will feel sick. She will feel very, very, uneasy. So what bothered her all the time? If you read the story well enough, we come to realize actually the mother has developed a very strong sense of guilt. The mother feels guilty. Guilty about what? About whom? About what had happened to her elder sister, to Keiko. In other words, the mother feels guilty about the death of the daughter. We learn from the story Keiko finally moved out from the house in London. She chose not to stay with the mother, with the stepfather, with the younger sister, Nikki, because the younger sister, the half-sister, Nikki, and the stepfather obviously did not treat Etsuko well enough, because in their mind, Etsuko is a pure Japanese, whereas Nikki, at least, is 50% British. So you see, even from the story, we can more or less feel, the so-called prejudice and bias of the British over the Japanese. Or you could argue, of the West over the East. So that's the reason why Keiko decided to move out, and she rent a house in a big city in London, Manchester. Manchester is now the second largest city after London, after the capital. And finally, for some good reason, or she finds life is so unbearable, Keiko chose to kill herself, chose to hang herself by using a rope, 用绳子吊死. That's what happened to Keiko. And the mother feels very guilty about the death of Keiko, thinking it's all because of her. So from this perspective, Etsuko tells a story in order to get rid of the ghosts in her, to remove the ghosts in her. In other words, storytelling, writing in this sense, is a kind of what? A kind of 驱魔. In her mind, she has a certain more in her mind, and she needs to get rid of it. Otherwise, she cannot live in peace. So this is another issue for you to think about. Writing or storytelling as a kind of therapy, as a kind of as a kind of effort to remove something that has been haunting you all the time. And in this case, what has been haunting Etsuko and even Nikki is the death of Keiko, the death of the elder sister, of the elder daughter. So just give you some idea about why the author chose Etsuko to tell a story, why Etsuko has to tell a story. So as a first-person narrator, another good question for us to ask, to raise is, can Etsuko be a reliable storyteller, be a reliable narrator? Can we trust her? Of all the story she chooses to tell us. Imagine if you want to tell your own story, you are the first person storyteller. Can you tell the whole truth to the audience, to the public? Obviously, it has a lot to do with the so-called psychological barrier. In other words, I don't think any one of us could be 100% honest, could be 100% frank. We might try to hide something that is less pleasant, or that is even unpleasant. So obviously, what happened to a pair of here is Ezuko needs to tell her own story, but she doesn't want Nikki to know the story she's telling is her own story. So she needs to invent some woman that looks like her. She needs to invent some daughter that looks like Keiko. So in the beginning, you see the sentence, that same evening, I was standing at the windows looking out into darkness. I, of course, refer to the mother, refer to Ezuko. When I heard Nikki, when I heard my daughter say behind me, what are you thinking about, mother? So they start a conversation with this question. The daughter asked the mother, what are you thinking about? You could say this is a good strategy because the daughter asked the mother this question. The mother can find some good excuse to say what she wants to say because the daughter is asking what she is thinking about. So the mother said, I was thinking about someone I knew once, a woman I knew once. So the mother said, at this moment, I'm thinking about a woman. I'm thinking about a woman I happen to know. And then the daughter continues, someone you knew when you, etc. Before you came to England. The mother said, yes, I knew her when I was living in Nagasaki, long before I met your father. That's the very beginning on page 10. In other words, by using these kind of strategies, Ezuko, instead of saying, I'm telling my own story, she will tell Nikki, Nikki, your question reminds me of a woman I happen to know when I was living in Nagasaki, when I met, before I met your father, the English gentleman. So then she continued to say, the woman I happen to know when I was living in Nagasaki is a woman named Sachiko here. Okay? So obviously, the good strategy of Ezuko is she creates a mother character, Sachiko. And of course, through the story, we know Sachiko, like Ezuko, also has a young daughter named Mariko here, Mariko. So Ezuko's story actually is about the story between a mother and a daughter, between Sachiko and Mariko. Don't forget, try to link Sachiko and Mariko with Ezuko and Keiko. So our argument is, Ezuko was telling her own story, but pretending, disguising the story as if it was Sachiko's story. So this is her strategy of storytelling. In other words, she was telling the younger daughter, now, Nikki, let me tell you the story of a woman I happen to know when I was living in Nagasaki. So in this sense, we could argue a pale view of here actually is a story within a story, because Ezuko is telling Sachiko's story. And from Sachiko's story, we could make a good guess. Actually, Sachiko's story is Ezuko's her own story. But because she's the first person narrator, she feels a little bit uneasy or a little bit ashamed if she begin when she tells the story that by saying, this is my own story, daughter. But instead of saying this, she has to pretend it's a story of some other woman she happened to know when she was living in Nagasaki. I think another important hint for us to remember is, where did the story happen? We know in the beginning, Nikki, who stay in London, who live in London, come to see the mother in the suburban area of London. So that part, or we could say the modern part, the present part, happens in England, in London. But how about the past? What happened in the past? Where did the story in the past happen? Nagasaki. So another interesting question for us to think about is, actually, you could argue a pair of years as a tale of two cities. You remember the story, A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, 双城记. Okay, of course, in Charles Dickens, it's a story between two cities, between London on the one hand and Paris on the other hand. But here you could also argue a pair of years is a tale of two cities, and the two cities is a big city, one in London, one in Nagasaki. But Nagasaki actually is historical significant important. You remember in the year 1945, Japan surrendered, and Japan's surrender ended the war in the Pacific. Why did Japan choose to surrender? Because of the two atomic bombs. One atomic bomb attacked Hiroshima. The other atomic bomb attacked Nagasaki. So today, when we think about the atomic bomb, 原子弹, we always think about Hiroshima, 广岛. Hiroshima has been always associated with the atomic bomb because the very first city that has received attack of the atomic bomb, Nagasaki is the second city. But why in Nagasaki? You could imagine the author could set the story in Taipei, or in Tokyo, or in Kyoto, or in Osaka, if you want to choose a city in Japan. Why in particular he chose a city in Nagasaki? This might be a good question for you to think about. But one very clear hint is the author Ishiguro himself was born in Nagasaki. And don't forget, A Pale View Here is Ishiguro's very first novel. So perhaps by using his own city, the city he was born, as the setting of the novel, the author Ishiguro perhaps is trying to pay homage, pay respect to the city where he was born. This could be one good, argument for you to make. But of course, if you think about Nagasaki as the second city in Japan that was attacked by an atomic bomb, then you can interpret the setting of Nagasaki in a more symbolic, more significant manner. You can think about this. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about the city Nagasaki and its symbolic function in the story. Okay, so after the beginning, then of course we come to the end, the ending. And last week I also mentioned a little bit about the ending. We know Nikki planned to see the mother, but in the story, actually, we do not know how long she planned to stay with the mother. Even the mother herself doesn't know how long Nikki has planned to stay with her. But as the story tells, after 5 days of stay with the mother, Nikki decided to depart. Nikki decided to return back to London. So here we have the very last paragraph of the story. I would like to have seen her off to the railway station. It is only a few minutes walk. In other words, Nikki is trying to take the train back to London, and the mother wants to see her off to the train station. But Nikki doesn't like the idea because the idea seemed to embarrass her. Don't forget, Nikki is a mature woman already. So she left shortly after lunch with an utterly self-conscious air. Here, air doesn't refer air in the sky. Air refers to what? To manner, attitude. So the mother is telling the daughter leave her house, return back to London with self-conscious air. In other words, she knows she's leaving as if she were leaving without my approval. The key point is approval. In other words, when Nikki decided to return back to London, Nikki realized her stay was far too short because it's rare, it's not that easy for her to travel pretty often to see the mother. Don't forget, even during her stay with the mother, Nikki is always engaged in making phone calls, receiving phone calls to her boyfriend. So Nikki has her own life to live. So that's the reason why, at first, she might have planned to stay for 2 weeks, for 10 days, or even for 1 month. Obviously, far more longer than just 5 days. But eventually, how come she just stayed for 5 days? One good reason is the two, both the mother and the daughter, found that they just could not live in peace if they two stayed together. They try to avoid the issue, the topic of Keiko. But the more they get together, the more they talk about Keiko. Eventually, Keiko turned out to be a nightmare whenever they get together. So that is the reason why the mother is saying, as if she were leaving without my approval, without my consent. And you see what happened in the outside. How about the weather? The afternoon had turned gray and windy. This is the weather, gray weather, windy weather. Don't forget why the author in particular mentioned the weather when the novel is about to end. You remember in the beginning, when Nikki arrived to see the mother, the author also mentioned the weather. In the beginning, it says the weather was gray and windy. So what's the function? By referring to the weather, one good argument is the author used the weather as a way to reflect the mindset, the attitude, the tone of the characters. So if you use these two adjectives, gray and windy, to describe the overall tone of the novel, I think you are quite in the right, okay? In other words, the novel, actually the overall tone, 语调 of the novel is gray and windy. And gray bring us back to the title of the novel, A Pale View of Here. Pale means gray, means vague, means not clear. And also gray and pale remind us of another important topic in the novel that's called memory, Ezuko's memory. You could read this novel actually as Ezuko's memory of what happened to her in the past while she was staying in Nagasaki, Japan. So the novel in this sense could be Etsuko's memory of things past or remembrance of things past. You remember this is Proust's good title of her long novel, Remembrance of Things Past. Or you could argue the whole novel is Etsuko's memoir. Memoir, that's French. 回忆录, okay? So, when Nikki was leaving, the afternoon had turned gray and windy, and I, the mother, stood on the doorway, okay, in front of the house. She walked down to the end of the driveway. The driveway is the pavement, okay? When she reached the gate, Nikki glanced back. The daughter looked back and seemed surprised to find the mother still standing at the door. I smiled and waved to her. This is the very ending of the novel. In other words, imagine if you want to make this novel as a movie, how are you going to end this movie? It's quite sad in a sense. It's quite melancholy. Melancholy, 忧郁啊，带有感伤。Why? Because it's parting. 分离呀。Parting between the mother and the daughter. And the mother tried to smile to the daughter and tried to wave to the daughter. But obviously the mother realized perhaps after this meeting, who knows? Another meeting could be 1 year later, could be 2 years later. So the ending actually is the parting. And the beginning actually is the meeting. Okay, so you could argue the novel begins with the meeting and ends with parting. And this is more or less like life. 人生没有不散的宴席嘛。Okay, when you meet, after the meeting, then you have to part. Okay, so meeting and parting, and between meeting and parting, what happened is the whole novel, is the whole book. So you could argue, actually, the book based upon the edition we are using has altogether 183 pages. So these 183 pages covers the conversation, the story between Etsuko, the conversation between the mother and daughter in 5 days. Of course, we feel quite lucky because if the mother and the daughter stay longer, then the book might turn out to be 300 pages instead of just 183 pages. Okay? And I, in particular, mention, the book is divided into 2 equal parts. And we have chapter 6 as the end of part 1. And of course, the whole novel has altogether 11 chapters. So the first part has 6 chapters. The second part has 5 chapters. You could argue it's almost divided equally. So you could also argue the novel has 2 equal parts. So the ending of part 1, we should pay more attention to it. What happened at the ending of part 1? Here I just quote the last, sentence at the end of part 1. In fact, I realized something else this morning. Easy for us to imagine who is this I? Etsuko, the storyteller, the narrator. I realized, another key word is realize. What does realize mean? Understand. I know. I could reach some good conclusion. I realize. Okay? You could argue, realize refer to a moment of knowledge, a moment of understanding. Actually, it's more a moment of illumination. In Chinese, 就顿悟, 体悟. There's a good term in English called epiphany. Epiphany is moment of sudden awakening. In the past, the mother was ignorant. was not aware of what happened to her. At this moment, she suddenly realized, she suddenly, woke up to some fact. Okay? So the speaker says, I realized something else this morning. I said, something else about the dream. I think the key word is the dream here. When you read the story, you come to realize, actually, the dream plays a very important part in the story. Even in the very beginning, the mother started to tell the daughter, last night, I had a dream. And she did not tell the daughter whether it was a good dream, it was a bad dream. But obviously, the daughter could sense, obviously, it's not a good dream. So the daughter tried to comfort the mother. Say, mother, if you have a dream, that's because you do not sleep well. Because your country house is too quiet. And because it's too quiet, so you have this kind of dream. If you live in a crowded city like London, you will not have this kind of dream. So actually, the mother whenever the mother brings up the issue of dream, the daughter always try to play it down. Try not to, stimulate or encourage the mother to continue with her story about the dream. So you see, here the author says, my daughter did not seem to hear, not because the daughter is not interested, but because the author knows the real nature of the dream, and the daughter doesn't want to encourage the mother to continue with her dream because she knows it's not a good dream, it's a nightmare. And then the mother continued to say, even though the daughter chose not to hear, you see, I said, the little girl isn't on a swing at all. So the dream she mentioned to Nikki was she dreamed about a little girl who is playing on a swing. Swing in Chinese, 荡秋千. A girl playing on a swing. But the mother here says, actually, the girl is not on a swing. It seemed like that at first. At first, it seemed like the girl is on a swing. But in reality, she is not. But it's not a swing she is on. Then you see, Nikki, the mother, the daughter, murmured something and carry on reading. So, the daughter was pretending. She was engaged in reading. She did not want to hear about the mother's dream. Then you might wonder why. Okay? The daughter doesn't want to hear about the mother's dream. If the daughter is a listener, is a reader, as a listener, she should be quite curious about the mother's dream. But as we learn from the story, the daughter actually choose not to listen, choose to ignore on purpose. Okay? Because the daughter realized actually it's not a good dream, it's a nightmare. So our question is, what happened between part 1 and part 2? Why did the author end part 1 like this? In other words, at the end of part 1, we have a moment of illumination. We have a moment of awakening. Someone wakes up. Who is this someone? Etsuko. The mother wakes up. In the beginning, she pretends the dream is innocent. There's nothing else more to the dream. But at this particular, chapter, when part 1 ends, the mother realized, no, the dream is not innocent at all. There is more to the dream than what she has thought in the beginning. So this is also, the end of part 1. So far, I just give you some idea about the overall, structure of the novel. And then, before we end this session, I think I have some review questions for you for so far. For example, one easy question is, how long did Nikki stay with her mother? Answer is obvious. Then another question is, why? Why did Nikki come to see her mother? Why? Why in particular she take the trouble to travel to see the mother? And then, of course, who is Etsuko, who is Sachiko, who is Keiko, who is Mariko? These 4 main characters. Of course, there are some other characters, like, Etsuko's husband, Jiro. Jiro is an important character. Like Jiro's father, Etsuko's father-in-law, Otaka-san. Because Jiro and Otaka-san represent 2 different generations. So in the novel, we see a society that is undergoing some big change. It's a kind of transitional or changing society, and transitional from the old tradition moving to the new one. And the old tradition actually is represented by Jiro's father, Etsuko's father-in-law, Otaka-san. And then the new generation is represented by Etsuko and her husband, especially her husband's friend. And then the very first conversation in the novel between the mother and the daughter, and the very last question Nikki asked of her mother in the book. Okay, this is the very, very last question. Do you still think about Japan a lot, mother? Okay. And then, how does the story get the title, A Pale View of Years? I think these are some very simple review questions before we move to next slides. Okay? And here I want to say a few words about aspect of the novel, because A Pale View of Years is a novel. When we deal with a novel, when we read a novel, what important aspects we need to know? Of course, we need to know the story. We need to know the plot. In Chinese, the story is called 故事. The plot is called 情节. One interesting question is, what is the difference between a story and a plot? Here is a very interesting example used by Ian Foster. Okay? Here the difference is like the king died and then the queen died. According to Ian Foster, this is a story. The king died and then after the king died, the queen died. There is no causal relationship. In other words, there is no cause and effect. We just know the king died first and then the queen died. But if we move to the second example here, the king died and then the queen died of grief. Grief 是伤心啊. Then we learn about why the queen died. The queen died because she was too sad over the death of the king. Then this is called the plot. So you see the difference between a story and a plot. A story and a plot, the major difference is a plot is a story arranged in causal sequence. Causal, in other words, cause and effect. Okay, this is the difference. Okay, I just mentioned to you an important book for you to read called Aspect of the Novel, even though it's written about 100 years ago, but the book is still considered as one of the classics in understanding the novel. You know, in this classic, Ian Foster, okay, also a very well-known English writer of the 20th century, we all remember the very good novel he writes called A Passage to India. In Chinese, we have the title 印度之旅, okay? Ian Foster defines story as the chronological sequence of events, chronological, arranged according to time. Okay, a story is a narrative of events arranged in their time sequence. This is the story. This happened first, and this happened next, and then this happened. This is called a story. It simply tells us what happened and in what order. This is called the story. And what is the plot? Plot is the causal and logical structure. I think the key word is causal or logical. Causal, cause and effect. 因果关系，逻辑关系。So here, in the book, he says, a plot is also a narrative of events. Okay? The emphasis falling on causality. 因果关系. So easy for us to talk about the story, to talk about the plot. So this is one way for us to think about the story, the plot. Another important aspect of the novel is the character. Okay? In this novel, we have several important characters like Nikki, like Ezuko, like Sachiko, Mariko, okay? Like Keiko, like Jiro, the husband, like Ogata-san, Jiro's father, like Shijio, Masuda. These are the major characters. Of course, we have another important major character, Mrs. Fujiwara. She stands for the spirit of looking forward, the spirit of optimism, 乐观进取 the spirit. Okay? So according to Ian Foster, he clearly divides character into two types. One is called flat character. One is called round character. In Chinese, flat character 是扁平的 round character 是圆融的 In English, what is meant by flat character means a character who remains the same from the beginning to the end. In other words, the character doesn't develop. This is called flat character. A round character like the hero, like the protagonist, 主角, they develop when the story unfolds. They develop from beginning to the end. So at the end, we come to realize the protagonist becomes wiser because the protagonist learns more about reality, but they also become sadder at the same time. Wiser and sadder because the more they know about reality, the sadder they become. Okay? Then another important aspect of the novel, as I mentioned, is narrative perspective. This is very important point of view, 观点. Who tells the story? Who is the narrator? Could be the first person or the third person. In this novel, it's the first person narrator. Okay? Another important aspect of the novel is called setting. Setting, easy to define, is the time and the place. Where does the story take place? In Japan, it's in Nagasaki city. In England, it's in London. So it's a story, a tale of two cities, a story between two cities. Okay? The question I raised in the beginning of this class is, why does the story take place in Nagasaki? Okay? So this is where. Okay? Where? And why Nagasaki is important. I also mentioned Nagasaki is the very birthplace of Keizo Ishiguro. Then time. I didn't mention time. One question for you to think about is, how come Ezuko could meet her second husband, a British gentleman? How come the English people at that time were in Japan? It has much to do with time. So both time and place refer to the setting of the novel, okay? And then after time, after setting, then we have the theme, and the theme refer to the author's worldview, 世界观, the author's social vision, okay? In other words, what does the author try to say? Of course, a novel is rich. You could never say, okay, the novel only deal with this topic, only deal with that issue. The novel is rich. It can be interpreted from different perspectives. We can interpret the novel as negotiation over identity or negotiation with the past. Or we can talk about the novel as deal with nationality, 国族, 国籍, talking about displacement, okay? Talking about culture, tradition in the context of change and transition. We can talking about memory, we can talking about writing or storytelling as therapy. All these are the so-called themes in the novel. This is another aspect of the novel, okay? So I think I will end up with, aspect of the novel here. And for next week, we'll continue from chapter 2 of the novel. We'll continue from here, okay? Thank you.